Hello and welcome again. And we are starting our next panel, panel 3, which focuses on visibility and invisibility. So the panel investigates the complex tension between regimes of visibility and invisibility, exploring how artistic practices operate within what has been termed geopolitical scotoma, the visual occlusions and knowledge gaps that distort our reading of marginalized regions, histories, and contexts. The contributors, wonderful contributors, and there'll be 6 presentations, 4 in person and 2 online. Examine art that is frequently excluded from formal representation, ranging from the subcultural outsiders of nocturnal collective movements to the chewed up bodies of prisoners documented through the fragile medium of bread. Central to this discussion is the immateriality of work, particularly sound, which is positioned as a temporal architecture that materializes the invisible through vibration and frequency, creating zones of belongings that bypass conventional representational logic. Furthermore, the panel interrogates the economic invisibility of the arts, contrasting the corporate calm and seamless surfaces of platform capitalism with the unwritten, unpaid expectations of informal culture, labor, and presence. By exposing the invisible mechanisms behind art, such as military-derived psychoacoustic technologies, algorithmic infrastructures, and the vampiric reanimation of data, these papers reveal how informal practices can both reproduce and resist broader societal and economic processes of control. So please welcome our first speaker, Kitty Brandon James. She's a PhD candidate at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, where her research examines informal networks and art institute building in Moscow between 2012 and 2022. Please, Kitty.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. So this talk is provoked by a lecture given by the historian of Stalinism, Orlando Figes, in November 2022. He was promoting The Story of Russia, a book which argues that storytelling shapes political sociology and that control of Russia has historically and continues to depend on control of narrative. Throughout the talk, Figes compared Putinism to Stalinism, a cult of personality, history, and leadership, leveraged through battles over monuments and memory. This battle for foundational legitimacy, he argued, demands on controls of visible levers used to transmit ideas, whether that's television and film programming, monuments, or history textbooks, things that produce a spectacular top-down patrilineage of strongman rule. At question time, I asked how far these parallels extended into aesthetics, whether there might be a total art of Putinism or a culture 1, culture 2 equivalent developing. Figes looked at me, about as witheringly as one can across a full auditorium, and replied, "There is no art in Russia. There can be no art in Russia because there is no civil society." Now, maybe it was a throwaway remark, a rhetorical flourish, but if taken seriously, it raises a lot of questions. What counts as art? What kind of art does this claim make invisible? I mean, are we really defining the hyper-visible state-sponsored monumental sculpture, the Rublovka dachas, the architecture of corruption and display, as art? And what about this gargantuan private contemporary art foundations in the centre of Moscow? And what happens to the practices that do not seek or cannot survive this kind of visibility? So this talk I'm going to spend a tiny bit of time describing the cultural context of the 2010s in Russia, which I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. Then I'm going to go into a little bit of a hodgepodge of theory, and I'm going to finish with discussing the case study of the Night Movement. The cultural and political context of 2010's Moscow is marked with a paradox that circles visibility. As state violence and pernicious legislation both increased, so too did experimental art institutions, parks, and self-organised initiatives. Michal Jampolsky, as featured on the slide, describes this simultaneous horror and cultural boom, a bourgeoisification of culture and a depoliticised public sphere in which culture and violence bubble together and which the lines between pro-governmental business, contemporary art and cultural policy become increasingly blurred. Visibility, of course, is never neutral. It is structured by power. And here in Let's Sharpen Our Optic Nerves, Sergei Ushakin and Vlad Strukov describe what they describe as a recognition problem in contemporary Russian visual culture, a political overdetermination of what can and what cannot be seen. Strukov, as Katya mentioned, calls this a geopolitical scotoma, systematic blind spots which shape how the region is read. And under the creeping authoritarianism of the 2010s, this raises at least two ethical questions. First, how might we, if we are outside of Russia, with very real difficulties of access, avoid doing the work of the state? How do we avoid minimizing plurality by over-determining what very much is visible, which is politics? And second, how do we study practices that rely on ambiguity and invisibility in order to survive? Edouard Glissant might be useful here. He speaks about a right to opacity, a refusal of the demand that people and practices must be fully transparent. As he writes, to demand transparency is to demand submission. Relation struggles and states itself in opacity, and we clamour for the right to opacity. People should be camouflaged. Good concealment is good defence. Continues, I mean, this is a bit hodgepodge, but continues, let's say, Roland Penrose, who's a surrealist and a Quaker and a lecturer on camouflage for the Home Guard during the Second World War. And here are some images from, he kind of instructed people how to use surrealist techniques to camouflage infrastructure in order to be invisible from the so-called enemy, or in this case, the actual, very real enemy. But rather than thinking in terms of opposition or withdrawal, I think at this point in time, before 2022, in Moscow, it's useful to think about betweenness, about thinking about being partly inside and partly outside, close enough to participate, far enough to resist a unified norm. This logic has a really quite long artistic genealogy from Soviet Russia. Writing about Sots Art, the co-founder, Vitaly Komar, describes a typical condition of duplicity which combines official and unofficial, private and public. Artists, he said, learnt to see like senses and become senses themselves, working in between, with the gaze rather than against it. Camouflage, legibility, Aesopian language, duality, tricksterism play, this is where the argument sits. The argument that perhaps between 2014 and 2022, artists in Russia did not all withdraw from politics, but instead they negotiated visibility as an aesthetic strategy, playing with opacity and informality, and drawing on inherited conceptual languages to critique affectively, not necessarily through language, but through relations, through embodied and ambiguous action. To show how this worked in practice, I now turn to a case study. I now turn to a case study. Here we go. The Night Movement. So the Night Movement were a loose collective of artists who collaborated with and courted the night to stage actions, acting as active agents of their own legibility. There we go. I'm hoping that I'm just clicking through pictures here. Here we go. I just wanted to show you some pictures of the sorts of things that they do before talking about it. The Night Movement started long before we announced it, so reads their manifesto. Night, as a refuge for fools and hooligans, existed long before the collective itself. But true night, the organisers insist, requires professionalism. It's gone a bit too far. Okay, thank you. A self-organised committee comes up with the ideas for spending one night or another. An appointed curator takes responsibility for the organisation and the conduct of the night. The night lasts until morning, and then it's followed by the next one, which is even more lethal. Founded in January 2015 by Varvara Georgizova and Anastasia Ryabova in the aftermath of the 2014 annexation of Crimea and amid growing disillusionment with art institutions, over 7 years the collective organised 29 nights. Each was singular, with a ludic, hooliganic, erotic nature and conceptual vigour. Each was shaped by a curator who submitted an application and signed a certificate, borrowing the language of institutions, even as the practice itself ran on informality. The nights tended to make visible what usually remains invisible, embodied practices, affect, chance, and process. We were always playing with visibility, says Ryabova when I spoke with her. Sometimes we were very public, sometimes we were disappearing, moving into a grey zone, refusing to be archived neatly or mapped as data points. The inaugural night took place almost 9 years ago today, on the 13th of January 2015, on the eve of the old New Year. It was called Cold Night, or Night of a Healthy Spirit, and revolved around bodies, borscht, and snow. 13 divers plunged into a pre-cut black square of ice in the forest. Others held towels, took photographs, and later recounted the mythology. A fist fight broke out between two former members of the Moscow actionist group Radek, who resolved a long-standing estrangement by wrestling naked in the snow. Afterwards, everyone ate borscht. The known Marxist of the group played the accordion, and Igor Mukhin, professor at the Rodchenko School, took photographs. The curators framed Cold Night as a critical response to the agenda of corporeality imposed on Russian society, the reintroduction of religion into public life, into ethnic violence, and the police brutality accompanying dissent, creating a sort of parody of both Soviet health focus and contemporary practices. Serendipity and chance were central to many nights. And although Ryabova describes the project as micro-political rather than political, many nights unfolded directly along the contours of Putin's domestic and foreign policies, with the state sometimes acting almost like a curator. So I've put a picture of the night escapade on the screen, which staged, apparently, according to the curator, enforced oppression-derived inertia through shibari. But half of the invitees failed to arrive because they had been tied up at political demonstrations. The Night of Scary Stories, similarly, curated by political theorist and historian Elli on the 28th of February 2015, took place less than 24 hours after the murder of Boris Nemtsov, less than 30 minutes away. Remembered by participants as homey and cozy, it created a space where, as Butuzova noted, cold analysis and common sense are the last things that can help us understand what is happening. In October 2015, the Night Disco, curated by Alexei Borisinok and Olya Sosnovskaya for the Kiev Biennial, offered a subtle but very fierce critique of access, visibility, nationality, gender and geopolitics against the background of war. Again, this critique worked through affect and biopolitics, or choreopolitics. Music was crowdsourced by biennial participants and fed into an algorithm designed to skew whose song would be played. So X is the probability that your song would be played. It equals A minus B plus C, -2 for Russians, -1 for Belarusians, +5 for Europeans, times 1.5 if you're male. Where A is the number of subordinates you have, B the number of bosses, and C the number of connections. So members of the Kiev Biennial Organizing Committee, curators, artists were all asked this question. Not all, but many were asked this question. This asked for their playlist suggestions, and then this was fed into this algorithm. It was a deliberately crude and highly political algorithm, exposing how taste, power, and visibility were redistributed and distributed within the Kiev biennial, and national cleavages were emerging among people who had previously danced together. Held at Closer, a former linen factory turned creative hub, the disco coincided with the visible aftermath of Maidan. Overturned paving stones, blue and yellow painted street furniture, and beer tents full of political debate. And what really added to this night also was the penumbra around the edges. Journalists were giddy on this night. Tonight is a microcosm of everything happening now, one told me. Everyone is here. If the nationalists are in one corner, pro-Europeans in another, everyone from across the political spectrum. You can infiltrate anything if you pretend to be part of it, reflected Lena Klabakova, a regular member of the organising committee. And the night that I'm going to finish on happened in the daytime. It was called Hands Off Our Night. The curators, some now relatively serious academics and art critics, decided to infiltrate a conference on the night, organised at the State Institute of Art Studies by senior cultural historian Evgeny Viktorovich Dukov. The collective followed due process. They submitted 6 abstracts on plausible night-related topics that complemented the very real conference of chronotopes of marginality, surrealism, the nocturnal return of medieval carnival. Some of these presentations were delivered straight. Others used invented references and pseudonyms, and others used no words at all. Olya Sosnovskaya, who curated the previous night that I spoke about, who's just, I think, in the process of defending, or possibly has defended, a doctorate in Vienna on the politicization of dance, presented a paper titled Night Disco as a Space of Liminality. She plunged the room into darkness, with red and green pulsations and a rhythmic rave beat. She stood, poised, and remained silent. As the tempo quickened, voices from the state art side of the conference began to heckle. Have you finished the report? No. Do you have anything to say regarding liminality? This is unbearable. I think it's quite obvious that there's no aim to say anything. I wanted to show you. It's very good that you think it's unbearable because you experience the very logic through which contemporary cultural industries function, where pleasure is linked to repression and violence. It's hypocritical to write about it if you can't experience it. This topic is, I think, much broader than rave, and this gesture points to the ethical core of the night movement, where it is possible and necessary to analyse laws, monuments, and institutions. The night movement offers another register, which is affective, embodied, and relational. It shows how artists manipulated visibility, worked between official and unofficial worlds, and sustained artistic genealogies through informal, playful, and trickster-like practices that drew attention to social codes by appearing marginal or unserious, and that make visible that which is otherwise harder to see. Cognitive shifts, embodied experience, and affective change. And if narrative does shape political sociology, then perhaps these practices too belong in the story of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitty. And now over to Ksenia. Our next presenter, Ksenia Butuzova, is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Oxford. Her dissertation, Rebuses in Russian Culture from Spiritualism to Socialism, presents the first comprehensive history of rebuses, picture riddles, as a cultural medium in Russia. Trained in philology and art history, Ksenia works at the intersection of cultural history, gender history, and visual culture. She is particularly interested in overlooked forms of authorship and in how women navigated and subverted cultural conventions through popular media. Please.
Thank you, Katya, for this generous introduction. As you probably have guessed, we will today. I'll be talking about today about rebuses, and this is a genre that usually dismissed as trivial or merely amusing. And today I would like to argue that this particular marginal status allows us to see something important about informal art in the 19th century. And my central claim today is that rebuses developed a distinct trajectory for informal artistic practice, and that by examining their means of production rather than their iconography, we can identify roots of informal art long before the 20th century avant-gardes, with which informality is often more associated. Okay. Yeah. It's probably a good moment to say that rebuses are the small composite puzzles. Essentially, you have to guess the meaning of things presented and then produce a sentence out of it. For people who doesn't speak the language, it's merely impossible, but so you have to trust me on the clues I will provide later throughout my presentation. And my case study today is the work of Konstantin Karlovich Klot, and the rebuses published in the periodical Illustratia, trained initially. Okay. Trained initially for military, Klot left the service in 1830s and turned to wood engraving as a non-academic practice. From the mid-1840s, he published rebuses regularly in Illustratia, trained engravers through workshop labor rather than institutions, and remained outside of the Academy of Arts until his death in 1879. He is widely recognized as one of the earliest professional practitioners of end-grain wood engraving, and the central figure of the formation of illustrated print in 1840s and 1850s. Crucially for my argument, Klot also produced the earliest series of rebuses in Russian illustrated journals. These are not incidental amusements, but a deliberate adaptation of Western European genre to Russian media environment that lacked both stable illustrated press and established visual vocabulary for popular print. Yes, please. Yes. Next slide, thank you. Rather than asking whether rebus is qualified as art in a traditional sense, I propose a different question. What happens if we take them seriously as an informal art? By informal art, I mean a mode of production that is non-academic, workshop-based, commercially embedded, collaborative, and often anonymous, and structurally marginal to official hierarchies of taste. Seen in this way, rebuses became a diagnostic tool for observing how informal artistic labor functioned inside the 19th century media systems. Next slide, please. Rebuses entered Russian print culture unusually late. Unlike France, the Russian Empire had no historical rebus tradition. As a transferred form, rebus is dependent on a specific conjunction of technology, labor, and entrepreneurial experimentation. Their emergence was enabled by end-grain wood engraving, which made it possible to print images directly alongside text. In Russia, this development unfolded in a fragile institutional context, marked by an unstable commercial press and state anxiety around the circulation of images. Next slide, please. This is where Klot becomes particularly important. Unlike his elder brother, the celebrated imperial sculptor Pyotr Klot, Konstantin Klot didn't work in monumental or state-sponsored genres. He had no formal artistic training, and his career unfolded largely outside the Academy of Arts. He learned wood engraving through practice, workshop transmission, refining his technique abroad under the guidance of Henri Porret, a professional engraver who also produced rebuses and whose own training was rooted in the end-grain engraving traditions associated with Thomas Buick. On his return to St. Petersburg, Klot established workshop-based training that supplied illustrated journals with engravers and images. What changed with Klot and Illustratia was not simply the appearance of images, but the organization of image production itself. For the first time in the Russian Empire, images were produced regularly and serially for commercial illustrated periodical. Klot's workshop model made possible by training engravers specifically for periodical production and standardizing techniques of end-grain engravings. In this sense, Klot and Illustratia reconfigured the infrastructure of visual production while remaining outside of the academic state frameworks. This cultural informality of Claude practice was closely tied to his family life. Unlike artists whose careers were anchored in the state commissions or academic studios, Claude worked within the household that was large, multilingual, and materially dependent on ongoing production. He was married to Catherine Vignier, a French woman, and the French remained a language of everyday domestic communication. Through engraving and teaching, he supported a family of 5 children, and his workshop practice was closely entangled with the domestic space and routine. Next slide, please. This matters not as a biography for its own sake, but because it puts rebus making firmly within the domestic economy of small things. Rebuses were compact, repeatable, and compatible with interrupted labor. They could be produced alongside teaching, engraving, and family life, and plausibly served as a practical domestic function as puzzles designed to occupy children while work continued nearby. In this sense, rebuses aligned closely with the rhythm of childcare, allowing productive labor and supervision to coexist. Claude's family situation helps to explain why rebuses, rather than monumental or autonomous work, became such a central site of experimentation. They belong to the same scale as the household itself. If one looks closely to Claude rebuses over time, recurring visual figures became visible, particularly domestic animals such cats and dogs. They reappear across different puzzles. This repetition registers the proximity of rebus making to the engraver's everyday environment. Rebuses encode not only language but scale and closeness. They belong to the world of small things, repeated gestures, and familiar motifs rather than monumental statements. Rebuses also function as a key pedagogical tool. Their composite structure forced engravers to work simultaneously within figuration, typography, scale, and visual ambiguity within the compact format. They concentrated an unusual density of technical problems and functioned as exercise disguised as entertainment. After Claude, they rarely involved in a single authorial hand. To produce a rebus required visual composition, linguistic precision, technical engraving, and editorial framing. Authorship was dispersed between designer, engraver, editor, and reader. The structural collaboration is one of the reasons rebuses resist incorporation into conventional art historical narratives. The primary site where this practice became visible was illustration. Rebuses repeat their regularly, usually on the final page under the Russian label Zagadki, which translates as riddles. The journal encouraged readers' participation while rarely granting recognition, producing a form of access without status. This structure had clear gendered consequences. While workshop and editorial boards remain overwhelmingly male, women initially entered rebus culture almost exclusively as visual bait. Female bodies, most conspicuously exposed breasts, were used to attract attention and to increase engagement. Only later would rebuses become one of a few genres in which women could participate as producers rather than objects, and even then typically without a professional attribution. Rebuses also functioned effectively under imperial censorship. Next slide, please. Because meaning was encoded visually and phonetically, they enabled indirect articulation without an overt statement. In late 1840s, Nicholas I, wary of the spread of freely circulating illustrated material with no state control, intervened directly in Claude's practice. Having recognized the reach of Claude's workshop, the Straits withdrew the apartment they provided for Claude's family and disciplining both the workshop and the domestic economy that sustained it. Claude replied through visual indirection. The first rebus in Russian print, attributed by me to Claude, resolves the phrase, "Go forward along the straight road, the enemies will bark and fall behind." Next slide, please. Before I conclude, I want to make one final turn that clarifies the political stakes of this history. The foundation of modern visual culture for leisure in Russian Empire were laid by former military men, and this origin mattered. As illustrated print began to organize everyday visual experience, the earliest mass-produced images encountered for pleasure, instruction, and play were shaped by visual habitus formed within the military structures. In Claude Rebus's motifs of advanced pursuit, command, and territorial movement recur in the condensed and accessible form. Through serial publication and repetitions, these motifs enter the visual routines of readers as something ordinary and enjoyable, embedding imperial ways of seeing into spaces of leisure and education. Informal art played a central role in the process by translating militarized and imperial logics into small, playful formats that trained perception and normalized expansion as a part of everyday visual life. To conclude, Rebuses allow us to locate informal art at the point where modern visual culture in the Russian Empire first become reproducible, teachable, and widely spread. Through the case of Konstantin Klot, we can see how workshop labor, serial production, domestic scale, and participatory readership shaped visual production outside academic frameworks while remaining central to mass culture. Rebuses reveal informality not as an exception, but as a structural condition of modernity.
Thank you very much, Ksenia. And our next presenter is Zlata Mechetina. Zlata is a London-based creative producer and co-founder of Fetish, a multidisciplinary platform working with experimental live events and music. Zlata's practice is informed by a background in art history and performance research with a strong interest in sound and digital cultures. Please.
Hello. I'll just wait for the presentation.
It should be a kind of a link, right?
Yeah, I'll just do an intro that I'm not an academic, I'm more of a producer, and I would call myself an internet folklorist. So yeah, quite a lot in my presentation going to be about internet and pop culture. So this presentation is based on my paper and research which examines hardcore and post-club culture in London as a form of, yeah? All right, I have a lot of content. So yeah, and I approach club sound not as music, but as a material force that produces temporary architectures of belonging. This project asks how sound, especially bass, organizes space, bodies, and collective identification within contemporary cultural conditions, shaped by platforms, algorithms, and fragmented authority. And like what cultural ideas constitute those ephemeral relationships in the clubs. As in the age of post-internet culture, where bloggers, platforms, and curatorial voices increasingly function as traders of affect, music is often relegated to background noise, through which everyday life is mediated. Customizable, trackable actions like scrolling, liking, optimizing, from the undertow against which sound accompanies the continuous labor of attention. For this reason, internet presence and folklore and content circulation constitute a legitimate field of anthropological music research for this paper. My approach is informed by the works of Gunzeli Yelchinkaya, Shimon Bazar, and Daniel Felstedt, whose writing on post-internet culture, memetics, design, and contemporary mysticism have been formative to my thinking. Next slide. Yeah. So I begin with the question, why sound becomes particularly significant under contemporary platform capitalism? So as visual culture today is highly saturated and increasingly automated, images circulate efficiently across platforms, but they're easily flattened, reproduced, and abstracted from embodied experience. Sound operates differently, it resists stable representation, and instead functions through pressure, vibration, and duration. As Steve Goodman argues, bass materializes the invisible, bending air into architecture, turning pressure into geography. This makes sound especially relevant for analyzing forms of organization that operate beyond visibility. For the context, hardcore as a genre was born in the factories of Rotterdam and margins of Berlin, and it's known for its tempo from 160 to 200 BPM that pushes the human pulse beyond comfort into the state where rhythm becomes architecture and repetition as a form of protest going against the classical music harmony, and by genealogy falling into the punk direction. Is considered quite violent and sometimes vulgar, and commonly accepted as the opposite of the show business. And I guess music makes this opposition quite audible. As Jacques Attali suggests in Noise, it forces us to invent new categories and new dynamics in order to regenerate social theory and understand the existing zeitgeist. But in recent years, music has increasingly ceased to exist as an autonomous sonic object and has instead become a mode of behavior within platform regimes. As in 2025 issue of 032C, Manual for Freedom, Research and Creativity, contributor Gunzalo Yalchinkaya expands on the idea that technology today does not demand belief, it demands loyalty. And power from technologies, flows through technologies in four stacks, through symbolic sovereignty, platform sovereignty, capital sovereignty, and narrative sovereignty. In this way, techno-feudalism is not faith in innovation or progress, but a voluntary submission to infrastructures that promise visibility, rhythm, and belonging in exchange for obedience and to their internal logic. And the contemporary music scene, from underground microgenres to post-club and hyperpop, begins to resemble a feudal system. Artists operate as vassals to algorithms, labels, and playlists function as territories and titles, and attention becomes a currency distributed not by market but by the machine of recommendations. Music is no longer primarily a work but a gesture of alliance, release schedules, visual consistency, mood optimization. And yet it is precisely within this compressed field that tension emerges and sound starts to act like a leakage, as a malfunction, and as a break in fidelity. So my research project works in two theoretical frameworks. First is sound as architecture. I'm drawing on Goodman, Labelle, and Lefebvre writings and treat sound as a spatial practice. Labelle describes sound as producing zones of intimacy and exclusion, while Lefebvre reminds us that space is always social produced. The second framework is a new medieval order. I'll go to the next slide. Yeah, perfect. So medieval music operated in a decentralized field of power through courts, churches, guilds, wandering performers, and today's hardcore and post-club scenes mirror this structure. Raves, DIY labels, cloud collectives, telegram channels, and small venue ecologies function as informal sonic fiefdoms, temporary architectures of belonging shaped by the contemporary mysticism and digital connections rather than law. So invoking neo-medievalism clarifies the position of the contemporary producer, not as a musician, but as broker of shifting publics, navigating a world where authorities diffuse and sound becomes one of its potent organizing forces. And in this way, rather than focusing on one genre, I will examine an ecology of circulation, especially queer and trans electronic scenes, DIY labels, bedroom producers, and platform micro scenes. I will start with the first case study. It's Sophie. Probably quite a lot of people in the room know about her. So her work foregrounds sound as a material force. It's promiscuous, it circulates through network and teaches us how to belong and how to lose our footing. And bass, especially in her works, is colonizing the body before it even reaches the ear. In Steve Goodman's terms, vibration is a force field, a weaponized affect that operates below cognition. And as one of many technologies, they started in the military, showing one of the many forms of the arts linked themselves to the forms of war and state policy. This industrial war complex did indeed slowly but surely moved into pop, especially hyperpop, a more DIY genre, which bloomed during the COVID pandemic. In the works of it can be, like you can hear it in the works of Arca and Sophie, and it realizes through the dynamic range compression and psychoacoustic optimization, technologies originally developed for military communication systems in order to maintain signal. In hyperpop production, extreme compression, clipping, and saturation repurpose these techniques to produce a constant state of auditory intensity, collapsing foreground, a background, and eliminating silence. What once served command and control efficiency is refunctioned as an effective overload. And I will show a couple of examples of that, so you can hear that actually. Let's do this. Probably cannot hear that. Give me a second. Oh.
Don't use mine.
There we go. And last one. Yeah, I guess we can hear that it's kind of like quite dark for pop music. It actually resonates with Paul Frasiato studies that and can be understood as a part of pharmacopornographic regime where technologies of control are redistributed into pleasure, identity, and affect. No, it's not. Sorry.
Maybe it's just to the visibility.
Okay. So Sophie's sound operates at a molecular level, but at a Deleuzian molecular level. There are no references to acoustic instruments. Instead, a sound is constructed entirely from synthetic waveforms. That allows sound to bypass representational frameworks and operate directly on the body. Frequencies touch without contact, producing subjectivity through vibration rather than narrative or symbolism. I guess we can actually press on the lower video. Yeah. So this idea is showcased at her conceptual prime time in Product. It's Sophie's foundational and genre-defining singles collection. And sound there is both immaterial and embodied, showing the distinction between invisible and tangible. And covers of those singles are kind of like very playful playgrounds, which shows her mood and kind of like technical advance. I'm gonna show a couple of excerpts. I guess we can move to the next slide. Yeah, I guess like after the presentation you can check out her video Face Shopping, which is kind of like, yeah, you can understand her ideas through there. Let's go to the next slide. Next case study is a bit more explicit and more confrontational. It's Cavalry, and drawing on Mark Fisher's language. I frame rave culture here as necromantic. Fisher described rave as a seizure of modernity nervous system, where culture persists in a state between exhaustion and continuation. And Cavalry, as a Glasgow producer, emerges an exemplar of how informal sonic architectures can be designed from the body, the network, and the digital archive. As she reflects in the interviews, her compositions favor sound that seem like they could be a horror movie monster, textural, guttural, synthetic, and yet visually bodily. I will show a couple of examples so you can visualize it, I guess. That's enough for now. And her work embraces distortion not as ornament but as structure. In her work Against the Wood, Opposed to Flash, she uses samples from horror games, malt-induced illness, and ambient noise to construct harsh auditory scenes, like excerpts from survival horror soundtracks. In this way, the DJ becomes an archivist and a parasite, reanimating dead, unproductive online data through sound, and then commercializing it through sampling, remixes, and mashups. Next slide. Oh, perfect. So Cavalry employs high-frequency sound, distortion, and noise textures that recall anti-riot sonic technologies. These frequencies produce a direct physical effect on the nervous system, and music becomes a way to organize violence through structuring data and noise. Okay, that's enough again. So yeah, and her aesthetic politics are significant as well. As a trans woman in electronic music, she speaks critically of platform capitalism, as she puts it, the Spotify machine. By prioritizing small venues and self-release, Cavalry positions informality as a site of autonomy. Perfect. Yeah, here I kind of I found some examples of anti-riot sound, and actually even recently on the news I've seen that the US acquired some technology that produces Havana effect on people, and basically that's a part of the sound weapon that is actually kind of quite innovative. Maybe we can try the first video. Yeah. I think that's without sound.
This device can take down an entire crowd using only sound. This is the LRAD, or long-range acoustic device. It's a military-grade sound cannon that blasts an ear-piercing noise at over 150 decibels, louder than a jet engine. It's so powerful that it can cause extreme pain, dizziness, and even temporary blindness. Imagine standing near this. Originally designed for the military, it's now used by...
Yeah, but that's I guess we're kind of making a step away from music being something having a physical effect on the body towards the idea that actually sound does cause effect on the body and can cause some health damage. Okay. Katya is asking me to speed up this, but we're nearly there. Yeah, now we're coming back to this idea of neo-feudal structures in the nightlife. So producers and DJs function as itinerant figures moving between microchords of attention, cloud economies, and informal patronage systems, as the authority is decentralized, temporary, and effective rather than institutional. And this reflects Ball's description of plural sovereignty under near-medieval condition. And an interesting example of that is a party collective, Genesis. So it's a London-based DJ collective with people from Chinese diaspora who often invite overseas artists and even showcase Vocaloids. But they're most famous for their MMA-inflected raves, which foreground bodily risk and confrontation. And that kind of aligns with Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of carnival, where violence functions as a temporary suspension of hierarchy. It reorganizes the social body through endurance rather than representation. And violence operates as effective architecture, producing intensity that can be streamed, can be archived or optimized. And as Fisher notes, the ghosts of earlier collectivities return in warped form, and here they return through bass, spectacle, and the promise of blood, echoing both medieval tournament culture and the carnivalesque ritual of collective reordering. Yeah, we can watch maybe 15 seconds of how it looks. So it's literally like boxing at the party. Can we? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think you can watch the fight in your free time. Yeah, so what kind of conclusions do we get from this? um, I guess that sound does produce temporary architectures of belonging that are informal, affective, and even though they're invisible, they're very materially real. As Frederick Jameson observes, late capitalism replaces depth with screen surface, narrative with platform spatial organization, producing a world that can be easily mapped but not meaningfully inhabited. And code intensifies this logic. Everything becomes reduced to binaries, optimization, prediction, 0 and 1. Whereas sound operates otherwise, it resists, exceeds representation, and unfolds as pressure and duration. Long before critical theory named the crisis of representation, music had already moved beyond it, exposing how capitalism gradually lost interest in representation. It's much about absences, as proven in even during E-Flux movement in John Cage's work 433, composed for any instrument and which consisted of silence. Absence there was not negation but materiality. It was a pause that exposed sound as a relational event rather than expressive object. And 433 remains a musical composition precisely because it foregrounds listening as an active, embodied practice, already stepping away from the primacy of the instrument towards sound as a situation. And in this sense, sound offers an alternative mode of organization within what Ball described as a new medieval order, decentralized and informal, where platforms govern through code, sonic cultures organized through effect, resonance, ideological and bodily synchronization, and actually not being against biopolitics or from a capitalist regime, but just being something extra. They don't clarify the world, they attune bodies within it. This distinction matters. And as James Brittle, New Dark Age, concludes that hope lies not in renewed mastery, but in new entangled ways of sensing. If vision has been compromised by platforms and computation, listening offers another epistemology. Buzz does not explain, Buzz culture offers no solution, but an orientational practice in the New Dark Ages. And if you are interested, you can explore more materials on this topic if you scan the QR code on the last slide.
Thank you so much. This was great. And shall we move on to the online presentation? So we've got two speakers online, and the first speaker is Elli Leventaki. Elli is an art historian, curator, and researcher. Hi, Elli. She's currently a PhD candidate at the Department of Theory and History of Art of the Athens School of Fine Arts, and in parallel is involved in exhibitions and art projects looking to address socio-political correlations within the field of contemporary art and critically comment on the invisible structures and principles of the art world. Welcome, Elli, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me and can also see my presentation, I guess. Thank you so much for having me here, even if it's through online presentation. I have been following actually the conference since this morning, and I have heard some wonderful and very powerful presentations, so I'm very happy to be part of this. I would like to present my presentation here with the title Disrupting the Institution, a curatorial response to the informal cultural labor. Actually, I would like to focus.
Shall we go for full screen presentation format?
Oh, it's not full screen? Oh.
It's just we can see the like your slides on the side.
Oh, I can see it full screen. Oh no.
Interface.
What about
It's in Greek, so
here?
I can't help.
But can you see the slides moving?
Yeah, it's okay. If it's fine, we can.
Yeah, because I see it full screen, but you're not. So I guess there's
I
a
see.
technical
Okay. Yeah.
thing. Um, okay. As I was saying, I would like to present this project to you that is actually draws from what is a lived experience for me as a cultural worker who is based here in Athens in Greece and juggling actually multiple jobs and not nearly having enough free time to partake in many like informal activities that are seen as essential and are many times naturalized in the art world. So, informal cultural labor can be directly linked to what is defined as immaterial labor. And this has been described extensively by Italian sociologist Maurizio Lazzarato, including a series of activities that are not usually recognized as labor, because capitalism seeks to involve even the personality and subjectivity of workers in the production of value. So, in other words, this immaterial labor is this theory that derived from mostly like theory around corporate works, like corporate businessmen, businesswomen who have like this different business lunches and other obligations that do not exactly qualify as labor, but are essential to people who work in all these different industries. So the same applies also for the cultural sector with all the different activities that are deemed as necessary but do not qualify as labor. Thus, although free time can be deemed as a time during which the individual is not working or not engaged in something, it seems that he or she ends up choosing what they're called informal activities for themselves, often without even perceiving them as such. And this is exactly the case for exhibition openings, and this is the project I have chose to present here today. So, attending exhibition openings is either a conscious or unconscious obligation that has been normalized as a valid mode of behavior within the field of culture in which the respective objects operate. Even when attendance at the opening of an exhibition is intended to be supportive of an artistic work, these hours that are put into exhibition openings are usually neither understood nor counted as working hours. And of course, they are not paid. It is not coincidence that this practice has become embedded in everyday life of art professionals, especially in urban centers, constituting another form of unpaid work linked to the expectations of the persons involved and the perpetual prolongation of the available time. So in this light, I decided to curate the project Free Time, a one-off experimental event that took place at the OK Initiative Space in Athens on 16th of January 2025, almost 1 year ago exactly. And in order to raise questions regarding the precarity of the industry overall, and the question of free time and what this constitutes even today. So the main
Sorry, Elli, are
idea.
you showing us another slide because we're still seeing the first one?
Oh yes, I've changed 2 slides. Oh my God. Do you see them
Could
moving
you?
now?
No, we are still in the first one. Yeah, now we see.
Okay, I will keep it like that. Okay, thank you
Okay,
for
yeah.
pointing this out. Um, So yes, okay. So in this slide, I decided to curate the project entitled Free Time as a one-off experimental event that took place at OK Initiative Space in Athens, in Greece, on the 16th of January of 2025, in order to raise questions regarding the precarity of the industry and the concept of free time in general. The main idea was to create a clean, gallery-looking space equipped with the standard fancy table for wine for the opening, but in this case with nothing else. So this is a photo and some photos of this project slash happening that took place at OK. So the so-called exhibition didn't include any artworks, but rather a list of names of non-participant artists as they were presented officially, who were interested in supporting the idea with their presence, who of course did not create anything for this project. There was also no mention of the content during the communication of the event, so the people who were coming were not aware of the lack of artworks beforehand, nor of what exactly would be featured. So free time was essentially a type of happening that came together when visitors started to arrive and created the opening experience themselves, rendering the exhibition also an artwork on its own. And this is how the space looked before the arrival of the people, before it opened up. So upon their arrival, people looked initially puzzled by the absence of artworks and a bit uncertain of their next move inside the space. However, after reading the curatorial text on the wall and helping themselves to a glass of wine, they stuck around the exhibition, let's say, area, casually discussing with other visitors as if this was a regular show for them. In some instances, once visitors realized that they were the ingredients of the projects themselves, they seemed more self-conscious, but in parallel, they reflected on the practice of attending exhibition openings in general and the need for a broader discussion on such topics. So this is the point where the invisible somehow becomes visible and the happening starts to occur. So what amazed me was that the lack of artworks did not seem to bother anyone eventually. They all engaged in the same process of socialization and exchange as they do in every opening, even though there was no exhibition to see in this case, attesting to the familiarity of this demeanor as an almost automatic procedure within the context of the art world. The experience of this happening made it clear that there are several profoundly established routines and behavioral patterns within the art world, which render the line between life and work even blurrier, and to which, of course, we are very used to. A series of so-called informal or complementary tasks are in reality additional responsibilities that are routinely expected of individuals working in the arts to be carried out during what is nominally regarded as their personal or free time. While these activities are frequently framed as enriching or essential for career development, their unpaid nature contributes to an ongoing cycle of inequality. They end up diminishing the perceived value of the worker's own labor and simultaneously set unrealistic expectations for others entering all already within the field, making it increasingly difficult for them to advocate for fair wages or proper recognition in similar circumstances. Needless to say that free time was organized with zero budget, based solely on my own hours of unpaid labor for writing the text, coordinating the process and everything, and the help of a few other people who naturally did so for free as well. With this in mind, I deemed it necessary to underline that romanticizing such unpaid practices is not okay. In the postmodern condition where the new working subject is required to remain constantly flexible, stand by to work, while investing on their development, improvement, and networking, the crystallization and the elimination of labor time seem more complex than ever. Given the subjective nature of the issue, the purposes of free time was to make the existing institutional framework, and in particular of the curatorial practice itself, which in other cases sustains or even reinforces the context, in order to turn the process of the opening into a field of reflection of its very nature. I realized that networking is now an ingrained part of the experience, this expected lifestyle of the members of the contemporary artistic scenes, as are other informal activities. So aiming for its elimination would be unrealistic at this time. However, realizing the class division that it causes and reinforces and addressing its repercussions could be the first steps towards constraining its effects and envisioning other formats of peer-to-peer exchange. And before closing, I would like to say a few words about this later project that started actually last month, which is a continuation of the curatorial approach of free time, but touches upon a different informal labor practice in the art world. So very briefly, it's called Verolino and is a conceptual curatorial experiment of a performative character that seeks to critically comment on the accessibility of cultural workers to various art residency programs in relation to class issues arising from this practice. The name of the space was not chosen at random, but refers intentionally to the city of Berlin, which is one of the most popular destinations among contemporary art professionals for art residencies, often conveying a pretend sense of success to those who visit it. It's again based on personal experience and my own inability to be absent for long periods of time due to my daily work. So in this light, I decided to create a kind of residency for myself in Athens in an effort to disrupt this contemporary barrier and stimulate public discourse on flexibility, unpaid work, and inequalities in the arts, eventually posing the question about which individuals have the opportunity to participate in art residencies. The participation in art residency requires, of course, sufficient time, unbound from obligations that can be devoted to attending such programs, effectively excluding individuals with specific backgrounds. There is therefore an absence of class inclusivity in the art world, which is otherwise emphatically opposed to discrimination, while hypocritically almost allowing only individuals from the upper social strata to reproduce within it, while excluding others. Oscillating between curatorial gesture and long-durational performance, Verolino aspires to serve as a catalyst for a more critical stance towards established systemic structures and conventional forms of expression by disrupting the art world from within. So feel free to follow the project if you want. You can read the manifesto, and feel free to contact me for more information or documentation for either of these projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elli, and it was great to meet you in Athens. And we are now going to our next presentation, and our next speaker is Jelena Sofronijevic. She's a producer. Jelena is a producer, curator, writer, and researcher working at the intersection of cultural history, politics, and the arts. They're also pursuing a practice-based PhD with Grace School of Art, curating exhibitions of Balkan and Yugoslavian diasporic artists in British art collections. Welcome, Jelena, and yes, we can see your presentation and hopefully we'll hear you now.
Can you hear me now? Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and it's good to speak with you all from Scotland. In his autobiography, Torn Canvas, first published in Edinburgh in 1957, the artist Željko Kujundžić recounts his journey from his birth in 1920 in Subotica, then the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, and now Northern Serbia, to his then contemporary practice in Scotland. The text recounts his embodied experiences of life growing up near and around the water, in particular, Food, interestingly, is scarcely mentioned in the text, which is surprising given its importance, if not centrality, in the Yugoslav culture in which he firmly placed himself. This changed in spring 1941, from which point Kujundžić commenced a daily diary. In the chapters that follow, beginning with Divided People, food, its absence and its presence becomes prominent, a means of distinguishing between the better and worse labor camps he experienced and was interned within. In Ukraine, his second imprisonment, but really part of an overlapping series of imprisonments, he writes of a toppled corn truck from which he took a number of grains. That corn came in very handy, he writes. I started putting one grain at a time in my mouth, chewing slowly and regularly for minutes on end. I made a few grains last for several hours, and so took away the edge from my hunger. Many men had now become so worn out by hard work on little food and rest that they were collapsing on the march. Their feet gave out and they fell, and the men beside them would haul them up and drag them until they were in danger of collapsing themselves. Meal times, rather than moments of relief or even respite, were also places of potential violence and trauma, which the artist very evocatively accounts. There were a number of houses in the area, all occupied by deportees like ourselves. Before we started work, we were all fed at the same canteen in the German officers' headquarters. As we were about to line up for breakfast the next day, the German orderly officer read out a short matter-of-fact statement to the effect that some of us had tried to escape but been discovered. I immediately thought, some of these Germans must understand Yugoslav or Hungarian after all. They have been listening in to our conversation. Names were shouted, and two of each group stood forward as they were told, idly swinging the tin cans in which they were to receive coffee and breakfast. They were motioned to stand aside. Before anyone realized what was happening, a command was given, some nearby guards raised their rifles, fired, and the young men sprawled untidily in the dust, their teeth clenched, their nails scraping along the ground. Some fell forward, others back, and their coffee cans made a little sad tinkling sound as they fell and rolled away. A great wave of fear spread through our ranks. The next order was for us to line up for breakfast. The food we were given here was what the Germans had themselves. They received their rations first, and then we were lined up. It surprised us, but it was an obvious political move. Men who have been starved for a long period feel grateful to anyone who then provides such wonderful food. This morning, we were given good black coffee with sugar in it and really good bread, spread with margarine and jam which had been cooked into a very thick, sticky consistency, and also slices of bacon dipped in paprika. It was wonderful food, but needless to say, very few of us were able to eat it. Those who managed did so with a hollow, empty look on their faces, gobbling like so many hungry animals. After breakfast, Sandor and I, as interpreters, were given the unpleasant task of arranging for the burial of the unfortunate men, who lay where they had fallen until the evening. I read you this extended passage not to reduce Kujundžić as an artist to his biography, but to highlight how this context affected his artistic mindset or even belief. Living through this context, Kujundžić began to question the very potential of art. His output decreased not only out of necessity or circumstance, but from disillusionment. Save for poetry and his daily writing practice, which became the text I've just read to you from, in his absence, I think we should consider the book as a continuation of his artistic practice, perhaps an informal form of art making. Zoran Mušić, by contrast, turned to drawing in this context as a means of simultaneously documenting and coping with his experiences. Under suspicion of being a spy, the artist was arrested from Venice, where he was then living and working, by the Nazis in October 1944. He was deported to Dachau in Germany, then the first and longest operating Nazi concentration camp. He was imprisoned until his release in 1945, during which period he drew constantly. In the exhibition catalogue that accompanied his previous solo exhibition at the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich in 2000, he is quoted, "I lived in a daily landscape of dead and dying in apathetic anticipation. During the day in quarantine, we were not allowed to stay indoors. We were in the mud, exposed to the cold. Cadavers pile up everywhere. Soup at midday. The skeleton still standing, clutching his mess and looking around for some place to drink his broth. He finds a free spot on the head of a cadaver, and drinks the liquid that is not dense, but is at least warm. He doesn't even think of where he was sitting and where he sits down his piece of bread made from sawdust and potatoes. He continues to talk about this context of total absurdity and again returns to bread, thinking of the dying prisoner who was sitting on the head of a dead prisoner, corpses not being declared in order that the living could share their rations. Drawing for him was an embodied practice, a repetitive practice, not unlike Kuyundic's gnawing of corn, but unlike Kuyundic, Music continues, I began timidly to draw. Maybe that is what saves me. Perhaps I have a reason to resist amidst the danger. He talks very specifically about how he is able to continue his practice in his context by hiding his drawings and working underneath the cover of night in particular. It's interesting, this body of work is often considered a complete break from his contemporary practice, which was then characterized by colourful representations of Italian and Dalmatian landscapes and abstraction too. It's true that for decades following his release from Dachau, Music returned to many of the motifs of his pre-war practice, including these quite nostalgic representations of Yugoslavian folk cultures. In part, this was in defiance to let his wartime experiences define him and his work. But this binary separation of subjects and styles, I would argue, is not reflective of the artist's approach. Music often created and displayed these figurative and abstract portrait and landscape works side by side, as you can hopefully see on the slide in front of you. His piles of bodies in particular are direct allusions to the same mountains where he personally found refuge after the war. If I'm attracted to dry, stony, mountainous landscapes, he writes, it's because everything's been worn down. In terms of form, the hills around Siena, for instance, resemble the skeletal figures you can see. They've been reduced to their essentials. Rocks to Music are fallen fragments that resemble the bones of the dead. To me, these piles also resemble pulled or fallen teeth, again connecting the body and the landscape. Music really depicted the body in terms of the landscape and vice versa. And perhaps we should think of this as a quiet way of expressing his experience after the war, how despite his defiance, as I previously stated, his perceptions on everything had fundamentally changed. Through their practices, Kuyundic, Music, and many artists documented and coped with the destruction and manipulation of the body during the Second World War. Their individual lived experiences and their labour, the very source of their works, are yet often detached from them in their conventional display. As I've suggested, Music, his work is categorised in these very binary terms, from the figurative works that you've just seen and these very explicit representations of violence to the more abstract works that you can see now. I would further that this violence is very present in these abstract landscape works, but that can only really be accessed through more direct embodied experience. Both Music and Kuyundic share different but very deep relations to Dalmatia, a mountainous region that stretches across Croatia and into Montenegro on the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea. It's not surprising that both of them also then take mountains as their subjects. Kuyundic continues in his text, I looked at the forbidding mountains that were soon to be the scenes of unimaginable slaughter, highlighting trauma in the landscape. This foreboding also speaks very directly to some of our own senses of Dalmatia today, whose peoples and environments continue to endure the violence and harm that has been enacted since and during the Yugoslav wars. We, though, here, in the context of an academic conference, can ask slightly different and more critical questions about these artistic representations. In some respects, we can consider both Kuyundic and Music's works from these periods as remembrances, works that are made from memory rather than direct documentation, as I've put forward. Torn Canvas was rewritten and represented from Kuyundic's daily diary, and Nous ne sommes pas les derniers, or We Are Not the Last, was produced by Music in the 1970s, inspired by the few surviving original drawings from Dachau, many, if not most of which were acquired by the Kunstmuseum Basel. This was a motif that saw him rise to critical acclaim in Paris in the 1970s, and which he then continued to pursue for the rest of his life. Why? We can look at the troubling romanticization of dead bodies that I alluded to in some of the previous passages I've shared. But alongside some of these questions around motive and accuracy, I think this provokes thinking about the internalization of particularly traumatic lived experiences over time. And it prompts us to think about who has the opportunity not only to self-reflect, to self-represent, forgive me, but also to reflect, to digest, and perhaps to move on from these traumatic experiences. Not everyone has that privilege, if it is a privilege and not a right, and that's due to their socioeconomic circumstances. Born in 1925 into a strict Catholic family in Fiume, what is now Rijeka in Croatia, Dusan Kusmic fought with the communist partisans during the Second World War. When he eventually escaped from Yugoslavia, he was imprisoned in Gorizia, which is now divided into Gorizia and Nova Gorica, two towns in Italy and Slovenia respectively, and very close to where Zoran Mušić was born, and was simultaneously moved from prison to prison, ending up in what he described as a concentration camp in Sicily. Traumatized by the suicide of a fellow prisoner and unable to eat, Dusan Kusmic would mold his chewed bread and saliva into sculptural works like the series of shoes you can see. He continued to mold them out of sodden bread until his release, when, out of economic necessity, he sold his entire collection to a jeweler in Rome. Resettled in Dublin by the Irish Red Cross in 1950, Kusmic lived the rest of his life through poverty, often trading his sculptures for sustenance. He received the support of Monica Kinley, a curator and the co-founder of the Musgrave Kinley Outsider Art Collection, which was once held at IMA, the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, and is currently held at the Whitworth in Manchester. This Kusmic's work highlights how, for some, this complex relationship between food and art persisted after the perceived end of war. But the present presumed archival record of Kusmic is limited to just a 4-page Word document and his 30 works, which are now held at the Whitworth, the dates for which are not recorded. This absence of archival material or context, however, prompts even closer looking and reading of his works, many of which do incorporate text. I'm particularly interested in these works on paper. On the screen, you can see The People of Love, Love Always the World. I've slightly adapted the title there because it's been mistakenly spelled by the artist. But in this, he writes poetically about food in a series of commandments. Take the Holy Communion, and then refers to that as the black pint, the brown bread, and the potato, the cabbage, the pork. For him, these were very important foods that also helped him to think through and express his identity in the context of diaspora. So each of these artists in turn turned to food, and especially bread, as a symbol or medium to differently articulate the chewing up of the body through war and conflict. Kusmic, just to continue, has exclusively been represented in terms of his wartime experiences, which has fixed him in this very specific context. In the past, this is a contradiction for the artist himself, for whom the practice he wrote about as a means of escaping the past. And importantly, it's quite detached from the reality of his practice, the socioeconomic conditions of his life on Mountjoy Street in Dublin, and perhaps more speculatively about the relationship between the daily bread, the body, and religion, himself being a devout Catholic. Further exploration of his work could actually situate this in the religious disconnections between Croatia and Ireland, also as two countries which were engaged in connected peace agreements following civil conflicts in the 90s. But this has all been prevented in a sense by the further displacement of Kusmic's work and his collection now to Manchester. And the fragility of this media, especially works on paper and infrequent display, reflects not just Kusmic's, but all of these artists' precarious positions and outsider, naive and informal categorizations. Though all related to the former Yugoslavia and all present in British art collections, Kujundžić, Kusmic and Mušić have not yet been exhibited together with respect to their shared experiences. I wanted to draw on their presence and absence in Kusmic's case in the context of the exhibition Seeds of Hate and Hope, which I showed earlier. This is part of a series called Can We Stop Killing Each Other at the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich. It's currently on show until May 2026, in which I've co-curated. Until I had contacted the Sainsbury Centre at the end of 2024 to query about whether they had any more information about Zoran Mušić, whose works you can see in the corner, and you can see the books in the cabinet there as well. They had no information available online. Indeed, many of these works had not been publicly displayed, which is something we were only able to deduce by the fact that few of them had been framed. On the screen at the moment, you can see one of the screenshots of the Zoran Music works as they're published online, and basically the sum of biographical information about the artist is the line at the bottom which states him as being French. For me, I'm particularly interested in why a diasporic artist, let's say as Kusmic, is less known and represented than an international artist like Music in the context of British art collections and exhibitions. Of course, this is also because of Kusmic's informal and Music's formal art training and their respective perceptions within the canon of art history in the UK. But also at the same time, naive artists such as Ivan Generalic and the Hladnica School in Croatia were much better exhibited in the UK during Kusmic's lifetime, with exhibitions of Yugoslav naive art at the Camden Art Centre and elsewhere across the UK. It's important to think in this context then about the accumulation and care of work. Kusmic's work was necessarily traded through his life in exchange for money, and now is displaced between private homes and what became of them, the local greengrocer, the convent who provided him warm meals, and more likely than not, rubbish skips where the work is probably now in the process of returning to the earth. Artistic and staged photographs that we've encountered comprise, in this sense, not only an archive, but then perhaps the artworks themselves. As I mentioned, the sum total of his record has been, up until now, this 4-page document. But in December of this year, of 2025, I was able to encounter a substantial amount of archive material in an uncatalogued collection in the UK. It's remarkable. Amongst many things, there are photographs of his work, there are handwritten letters, and importantly, there is also a newspaper article from the Stroud Observer published on the 11th of January 1988. This documents the artist's first and to record only solo exhibition, which was held at Prema in Gloucestershire, and was alongside another exhibition of an artist called Anna Zhamankova, as well as an outsider art exhibition at the Arnolfini in Bristol, in which the artist took part. In the article, which is titled Anything Goes in the World of Modern Art, it speaks of the 600 art enthusiasts who attended a walkabout related with both this exhibition in Bristol and Kusmic and Zhamakova's solo exhibitions in Gloucester. All of them were treated to a slice of sculpture cake, which was made by Gloucester College and Arts Technology catering students. The article begins with the image of this cake and curator Andrew Wood holding it. It's elaborate, wonky and striped, and decorated with an outsized flower, based on one of the exhibits by the Dubliner Dusan Kusmic. Take heart if your homemade cakes turn out a funny shape, the article remarks. They could well be modern sculpture. On the screen, you can see 2 faded out images, and I wanted to conclude by thinking about the digestion of individuals through institutional practices of collection and exhibition, what it might mean to collect and hold a body of work, whether a body of work like a human body can live within the collection, and what happens to those bodies that enter private hands. These materials are blurred out on the screen, not because of the artist's assertions or right to opacity, as we've heard about with Kitty earlier on today, but because of the institutions, the fact that they are being kept away in stores and drawers for only the researcher who might happen across the material in very informal means to encounter. I'd like to conclude with the prospects of more informal exhibition settings as such. This is from the first posthumous presentation of some of Jelko Kujundic's work in Scotland in an exhibition, as part of an exhibition in Travelling Gallery in 2025, which is a purpose-built bus that travels all across the country. It brought this work, torn canvas, which you can see on the far left of the screen, to audiences for the first time, albeit still behind a protective layer of perspex. I want to leave you with these questions about digestion and presentation, as they're ones that I'm continuing to explore through the exhibition making process, the possibility to more directly experience these works, and indeed the artist's experiences behind them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jelena. This was great. And I think, yes, we're just heading to the last presentation, which is in fact mine, and I'll try to be as quick as possible. I'm going to speak today about background, and I am going to talk about the aesthetics and politics of image space. So I'll now try to... Yes, it works. Perfect. So on 14 March 2022, 3 weeks after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Marina Ovsyannikova, an employee of Russia's state-controlled Channel 1, staged a rare and highly publicized anti-war protest during a live broadcast. During the evening news program Vremya, Ovsyannikova walked in front of the cameras while the anchor was speaking, holding a handwritten poster that read, "No war, stop the war, don't believe the propaganda, they are lying to you here, Russians against war." The protest lasted only a few seconds before the broadcast abruptly cut away. Ovsyanikova's brief but impactful act disrupted the normal flow of images of Russian state television, which relies on curated backdrops and digital effects to maintain its narrative control. Positioned between the anchor and the backdrop, her protest exposed the constructed nature of the televised environment, revealing how media functions as interfaces that transform and simplify complex three-dimensional realities into two-dimensional representations. However, Ovsyanikova's 5-second intervention did more than disrupt the image. Her action prompted an immediate tightening of security protocols, and live broadcasts were henceforth subjected to a mandatory 1-minute delay. This temporal lag suspended broadcasting in time, enabling inspection and approval before release to audiences. In the news articles that followed the event, Russian media censored the image by concealing Ovsyanikova's poster. The text on it was either blurred or covered with colored overlays. The anti-war statement was considered especially significant and fell under fresh oppressive laws that prohibit directly referring to the invasion as a war. The partial obscuring of an image is a direct continuation of visual censorship methods, which have a long history, particularly in Soviet Russia. In a state that emerged in a time of rapid technological development in the first half of the 20th century, images were systematically manipulated to erase purged figures and inconvenient events from historical records. A well-documented example is the disappearance of Stalin's former associates from official photographs, as individuals fell out of favor and were subsequently erased through retouching, an act that paralleled their political repression. Another commonly employed technique was the deliberate obscuring of faces. The faces of animals of people were crudely blackened and thus erased from the visual record. This layering of the image, where foreground and background shift places depending on political necessity, can be traced both theoretically and aesthetically. According to Gestalt psychology, perception operates through figure-ground differentiation. A figure is extracted from a background in order for meaning to emerge. Meaning is attributed primarily to the figure, while the background functions as a condition of contrast and visibility. Once a form is isolated and stabilized, the background recedes from perception and tends to disappear. The figure-ground logic is fundamentally reconfigured in the works of Gilles Deleuze. What Gestalt theory treats as a background is no longer a passive support for perceptual form, but a dynamic and generative field. Conceived as a virtual plane, it precedes and conditions perception itself, producing the very possibilities through which images emerge, rather than merely framing them. Elizabeth Cross emphasizes the dissolution of the figure-ground hierarchy in art, noting that in a Deleuzian space, there is no ready distinction between background and foreground, no figure discernible against a neutral ground, only becomings. Building on this perspective, I will now examine 3 examples from visual art. And photography, of course, gives us a particular way of thinking about how backdrops shape what we see and how we see it. Technical limits, social habits, and artistic decisions all come together in an image, creating layers where some elements are pushed to the foreground while others stay in the background, often unseen, yet crucial to the composition and its meaning. And a striking historical example is the 19th century hidden mother phenomenon. In early photographic portraiture, mothers were physically present during long exposures to study infants and young children, yet were concealed under drapery or behind furniture. This duality rendered material presence both essential and invisible. The mother's labor produced the composed image while being erased from visual recognition. The method emerged from the technical limitations of early cameras, which required sitters to remain motionless for minutes to avoid blurring. So beyond its technical function, the hidden mother reflects broader social and ideological structures. Domestic labor, particularly maternal care, was confined to private, invisible spaces, while the child, rendered visible in the photograph, embodied social ideals and sentimental values. The photographs thus operate as layered images, with the mother functioning as an unseen but active backdrop, mediating both form and meaning. Another example illustrating the logic of layered presence extends into material and visual culture. Metal coverings for icon, known in Russian as riza or oklad, present a historically significant mode of visual layering. Crafted from silver, gold, or copper, they protected the painted icons from smoke, touch, and dust, and enhanced its sacred and visual impact. They, emerging in Byzantine context and flourishing in Russia from the 17th century onward, these coverings transformed the icon into a composite object, where surface depth and material presence coexist. Some risas cover the borders, others the entire surface, leaving only the painted faces and hands, личное письмо, visible. This selective exposure produces a striking interplay between metal and paint, creating a tension between revealed and concealed layers that lends the inner image both mystery and authority. The spatial logic contrasts sharply with Western Renaissance principles. Of course, Alberti codified linear perspective as a method for constructing depth according to the logic of human perception. And Panofsky later described a perspective as a symbolic form expressing order and knowledge. And by contrast, orthodox imagery, through the interplay of riza and icon, organizes vision symbolically rather than optically. Layers unfold conceptually, emphasizing revelation over representational depth, and situating the icon as a site of sacred rather than purely visual engagement. The separation of painted surface and metallic cover further reveals the economic and social dimensions of production. Less expensive icons were often painted only in areas visible through the riza, producing a form of partial visibility calibrated to a specific visual regime. So the contemporary German artist Jelena Yashno extends the logic of layered visibility into political register. In her 2025 work, she presents an empty riza exposing the material and symbolic gap between surface and icon. Yashnov's practice interrogates how orthodox visual forms sustain ideological narratives, particularly in the context of the so-called special military operation in Ukraine. By emphasizing the absence or partial visibility of the image, she highlights how layers encode both symbolic and political meaning, demonstrating that backdrops, whether material or conceptual, mediate perception, effect, and authority. This dynamic finds a striking contemporary counterpart in Laurie Anderson Norton lectures, which are called Spending the War Without You Visual Backgrounds. And they were recorded during the COVID-19 lockdown. So Anderson, experimented performance artist, composer, and filmmaker, constructs a virtual stage in which her own body, Zoom backgrounds, deepfake masks, and shifting identities operate as interdependent layers of presence. Her lectures weave anecdotes, research, musical performance, and political observation, asking what time is it, which war is this? In doing so, she assembles a distributed collective body while simultaneously performing it herself. Anderson enacts a virtual chorus, cycling through masks and adopting the voices of figures such as William Burroughs, Brian Eno, Sigmund Freud, and John Cage. These borrowed identities function as notes in a collective voice, producing a chorus that is conceptual, performative, and digitally mediated. The Zoom background, far from being neutral, becomes an active medium, layered, compositional, and agentive, through which individual and collective meanings are continuously negotiated. Her videos evoke late-night television shows, yet in the context of pandemic isolation and social fragmentation, they rethink spectatorship, presence, and collective ethical reflection. Today, the digital image plays a central role in any war or conflict, with the mass production and circulation of visuals turning media into what Donatella Del Rata terms multipliers of violence. The war in Ukraine is unfolding within a social media-driven ecosystem, recorded and shared by countless personal devices. Although it's the most documented conflict in human history, as said by Hoskins and Jelena, this does not lead to transparency, rather the opposite. It's simultaneously the most sanitized war in terms of mainstream media and the least sanitized one in terms of social media platforms. This disjunction reveals not only a clash of ideologies, but also a struggle over the aesthetic and emotional regimes of war. Here, Russian state television has developed a highly controlled approach to media representation, turning war coverage into a visually coherent and curated spectacle. The convergence of media flows, technological apparatuses, and diverse human and non-human agents generate an informational spasm, an eruption in which the boundaries of realities become increasingly unstable. In this volatile interplay, reality is not merely represented but actively transformed, continually reshaped by digital and material forces. And what is most unsettling, however, is the dissolution of the very line between real and not real. Everything, whether fabricated or factual, has migrated into the realm of the real, where even illusions are absorbed into lived experience, becoming indistinguishable from it. Everything has passed into the real, even illusions, as Fuller and Wiseman say. This in-between space, a political and cultural condition, mirrors the unstable relationship between foreground and background in the digital image. In a liminal zone like one disrupted by Marina Ovsyannikova, when she stepped into the frame of the Russian state television holding a handwritten anti-war sign. Her act ruptured the background's presumed neutrality, transforming it into the foreground and exposing the usually invisible infrastructure of propaganda as both visible and fragile. This liminality also reflects a broader condition of spectatorship in times of war. Russian society, and much of the world beyond, has become habituated to living against the backdrop of a distant conflict, one that unfolds elsewhere, but not here and not now. This habituation is not merely a product of the ideological fatigue, it's actively cultivated. And in this context, the background is not simply ambient, it is strategic. The emotional and perceptual detachment it fosters is no accident. It is part of a broader regime of hyperesthesia, a concept developed by Matthew Fuller and I.L. Wiseman, and to describe a central tool of state terror. This condition in which sensory saturation paradoxically leads to emotional numbing is cultivated through overexposure to destruction via state-controlled media, social networks, and synthetic imagery. So state power then does not merely manipulate images, it re-engineers the very conditions under which images are experienced and believed. In doing so, it exposes a new kind of conflict, a revision of Ariel Azoulai's civil contract of photography, now recalibrated for the realities of cyberware. As Dyer, Witherford, and Matviyenko suggest, this revised contract is mediated by digital platforms, AI systems, and Cold War imageries. Thus, to live within this regime is to be surrounded by layers of misinformation, ideology, technological mediation, and historical residue. The image becomes a stratified object composed of both visible and invisible surfaces. The background, once inert, now exerts a subtle pressure on perception. It's not merely what we look at, but what we look through. It frames, distorts, and conditions our relationship to reality, and in doing so, it calls for a new optical vocabulary, one that accounts not only for what is shown, but for what makes the showing possible. Thank you.